sir. Thank you for having me.
Our subject this morning, or for you, is the xylazine. Hopefully I'm pronouncing it properly.
You are?
And the lack of it being it's not on the schedule.
No, it's not.
And we don't quite understand the schedule or why, and I don't probably need to know. That's more of a health and welfare issue. But for us, it's when a drug, we heard testimony from the Department of Public Safety that somewhere in the 50% neighborhood of the glassine bags that they test have some form of xylazine in them, some amount of xylazine in them, and that it's not illegal under Vermont law. So we're considering not the possession, but the sale of xylazine, making that a criminal act if it's meant for human consumption. So,
Right.
and we're wondering if you're going to have a new schedule soon.
So I'll just state for the record, my name is Kelly Doherty, Deputy Commissioner at the Department of Health. And given that xylazine is mixed with other drugs that are illegal, such as most commonly fentanyl, we're not sure that adding it to the regulated drugs would really have that much of an impact because the substances that they're being mixed with are already illegal. And so xylazine is only approved for veterinary use by the FDA. It was never approved for human use, and it's been approved by the FDA for veterinary use since 1972. Initially, they were doing some studies on whether it could help with humans with hypertension, but it never made it across the finish line because there were too many adverse effects. So you would probably want to get input from the veterinary community to see, if how it would impact them if it was added to the drug rule. But we don't think that it would really have a significant impact because, like I said, it's being mixed with other substances that are already illegal.
Understood, but my problem with it is the drug dealers are mixing it and then selling it as heroin or cocaine, and people are overdosing on it. Then when they overdose on it, Narcan or naloxone don't work on this particular drug.
That's correct.
So if the person if they can have the naloxone individually with them, it ain't gonna make any difference. So if the EMT doesn't get called, people are dying, and it's because the drug dealers are mixing it. So
Right.
My idea is not to make it illegal to possess it necessarily, but illegal to sell it for human consumption.
Right. Understood. And because it's so often mixed with fentanyl, the naloxone will act on the fentanyl component of what's in the person's system. And, with xylazine, because it's not an opioid, like you said, so it doesn't respond to naloxone, but doing other things like rescue breathing and things like that can also help avoid overdose with someone.
But that as soon as you can get to the rescue squad in time. In Bennington last March, there were 11 overdoses in a 3-day period.
Wow.
Most of them were cocaine mixed with xylazine.
Yeah, we are seeing that combination for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Michelle Childs from Legislative Council. I just have a question about thinking about if they choose to criminalize it, I'm thinking that it probably would need to have its own standalone statute rather than using 18 VSA 4234, which is the depressant, stimulant, narcotic kind of general that refers to the rule, because of language in that statute that that uses the benchmark, because you guys wouldn't have a benchmark for xylazine, right? So we'd have to do it separately, like the way that we have like for ecstasy or cocaine or something like that.
Okay.
Is that right? That's just my thinking. I just wanted to kind of confirm with you.
Yeah, I believe that would be the route to go.
Okay, thanks.
I don't know what that just meant.
I can explain it to you.
Okay, thank you.
And you should know too that the Biden administration released a plan through the Office of National Drug Control Policy. They declared the fentanyl, xylazine epidemic as a threat, as an emergency, and so they did issue a plan. And I'd be happy to send you a link to that is really about, doing more testing, obviously trying to disrupt the supply chain for xylazine, exploring other regulatory options. So I'd be glad to send you this report or this plan if you want to look at what the feds are doing around this crisis.
It would be helpful if you could, but waiting for the feds to deal with this.
Yeah.
Reminds me of Emperor Nero and Rome burned? We have a problem right now in the streets of Vermont with this drug.
Yeah.
It's particularly scary because of the fact that you have to basically have an EMT available to do to get the respiration back.
The other piece that makes this so troubling as well is the wounds that are caused by xylazine, and it's really having an impact on our treatment system, because the level of care that people need, in addition to sort of their substance use treatment, it's requiring a lot more medical intervention because of the wound care that's required.
Thank you for pointing that out.
Mm-hmm.
So, are there any other questions for Kelly? Kelly, thanks so much for taking time with us this morning. We appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Welcome. Michelle, if we could have a little discussion of this bill. I think we know, is there general agreement on the xylazine?
I'm more comfortable with it now that you say it's only for sales and not possession.
No, there's no penalty for possession. Unless they put a benchmark and do all that work, because I don't know what the possession would be.
I would do it so it wouldn't be that way. So can I just explain a little bit what I was talking with her about? So for the record, Michelle Childs, Office of Legislative Counsel. So, in Title 18 and Chapter 84, you'll have like cannabis, cocaine, heroin, whatever. There's a catch-all statute for depressants, stimulants, and narcotics that don't fall into one of the very specific ones. And so that's like where OxyContin would fall in, right? Because you can't list all the meds and drugs that are possibly out there. So what it does is it references a Department of Health rule, and the Department of Health adopts all these different drugs, and it sets a benchmark amount for kind of like a dosage amount, or that, for that particular type of drug, because they have valid uses and perhaps and can be lawfully possessed with a prescription, maybe, right? And so it's only, the statutes say if someone knowingly and unlawfully possesses, right? So it's different. So if I have a prescription for Oxy, I'm good. But if someone else has, Oxy and they don't have a prescription and they bought it, from some random person, then they would be subject to the statute. And because the amounts and the way that the penalties go, and it increases in penalty depending on how much you have, it'll say like, if you possess 100 times the benchmark, then the penalty is this. If you possess this amount of the benchmark, the penalty is this. But in this circumstance, because it's not a drug that is currently on the rule, and they're unlikely to put it in the rule because there's no benchmark for personal use, the way we would do it is we would model it after what you have for the fentanyl statute. And you remember when you created that fentanyl statute several years ago, it's specifically in there, like along with cannabis, cocaine, heroin, fentanyl is its own statute, and you did not put a possession offense in that statute. So I would look to your fentanyl statute. I'd kind of model that for you for the time being as a placeholder. I'll put the same penalties in there that you have for fentanyl, and then you can discuss those when we do markup. Does that sound good?
But it would not be possession.
No possession, right? Fentanyl isn't.
Just that I have the.
Right.
I
It's only
didn't know
dispensing and
fentanyl
sale.
wasn't illegal to possess.
Right. Yep.
Quite frankly.
Yeah.
So I have the xylazine in my possession. That's not against the law. It's what's against the law is I sell that xylazine.
Correct. Yep.
I do want to see what the report from the Fed, as you know, I'm generally hesitant to criminalize things, but I'm not entirely opposed. I do want to see what the federal government is suggesting. So I'll wait, I will look for that report to come.
Yeah, okay. But I don't think it won't be done. I don't think it'll be effective until after we've left. I don't trust them when it comes to this stuff.
I certainly understand that. It sounds like there was a report too with like suggestions about what we might do. And so I do want to look at that. Like I said, I'm not opposed, I'm hesitant, but.
So that's one thing you can do.
So one thing I will need to do that I'm not really qualified for is determining the amounts for increasing. So if I'm looking at the fentanyl statute, and again, it's just selling or dispensing, like the first one is the baseline. If you are knowing and unlawfully dispensing fentanyl, any amount, it's 3-year felony. If you're selling fentanyl, it's a 5-year felony. And then it bumps up in penalties where it says if you're selling or dispensing 4 milligrams of fentanyl, then you go to 10 years. I don't know.
For our purposes, just leave it.
Any amount, and then you can just pick up, okay.
At 3, whatever. The 3 and was it 5?
Mm-hmm. So just do that, okay, yeah.
I wouldn't get into
The amounts. Okay.
Because that gets more confusing. Okay. So it's 3 if you dispense it.
And 5 if you sell it.
If you sell it.
Okay.
That's for starters. That's similar to fentanyl, right?
That is what fentanyl is.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I wouldn't get.
And there's higher penalties for if you have more fentanyl, but for this purpose, we won't go there.
Yes.
So my understanding, and again, Michelle, correct me if I'm wrong, because I know we've talked about this a million times, but my brain sometimes struggles because dispensing is just the sharing of.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that I would be supportive of the dispensing penalty, but I would be able to get on board with sales. And that's such a frequent practice to sit with a friend and use together, and now that is criminalized. Like one of the things I actually, and haven't gotten to, would advocate for in F58 is that dispensing be removed from it entirely.
So then, if you give me xylazine, that doesn't meet the definition of dispensing?
That would.
Okay, thank you.
Do I know it's there?
That's the question.
I don't know it's there. You know it's there, but I, the user, don't know it's there. That's for you.
But
You didn't tell me what you were giving me.
how do I know what I'm giving you?
Perhaps I don't know,
Why are you giving it to me?
Because you asked for it, or you came over to use it with
I
me.
asked for xylazine.
Well,
I'm not interested in protecting people that dispense drugs, whether it's for sale or whatever. I'm not interested in protecting them from this particular drug. People are dying.
agreed.
I'm not interested in protecting
So I'll just read
personally. So that's my vote.
dispense. I'm just gonna read you the definition.
Thank you.
Dispense under chapter 84, which applies to all the drug offenses, includes distribute, leave with, give away, dispose of, or deliver.
But
So if
Or
I
deliver.
threw it away and someone else picked it up, that is now dispensing?
I don't know how that honestly is,
well, maybe
say
that's,
dispose of.
um,
I don't know
we
whether or
can
not
look
that's
at
been,
throwing it something away.
whether that's been interpreted. I can look at the case notes and see, but that definition's been there for quite some time.
So let's review what we have so far. We're gonna add, xylazine.
I guess that's one quick question, because is xylazine available just to walk into the veterinary and purchase it? Like for a farmer, if a farmer wants, could just, it's not prescribed or whatever?
I don't know.
Maybe we should hear from the veterinarian.
I will say that the way that you structure your drug possessions, it should not be an issue for the veterinary community, because the drug laws say person who's knowingly and unlawfully in possession. So the vets are gonna be in legal possession of it, I assume that through.
Right, but could a farmer come in and say, I need this, you gave it to my horse last week, I wanna.
I think that would be like a prescription for your animal,
Okay.
but I don't know.
Well, can we contact the veterinary association? I'm sure they can get somebody to either send us a memo on how they distribute it or speak to us next week, the next time we take up that with deal. God, this thing is getting more complex. Yes, sir.
Sorry to make it more complex. Are we done with the xylazine conversation?
I think so.
I wanted to revisit something I had mentioned when this first came out, which is on 1.1, it's on page 2, starting at line 9 to 14, which is the changing around of the defense there. I guess my first question is, are there permissive inferences for other crimes in this that are similar to this?
I would need to take a look, and I can do a little statute search and take a look. I feel as though I'll just say is that this part and then the definition section and how, and the knowingly, you kind of touched on it with testimony, but there hasn't been kind of a robust discussion about some of that stuff.
Yeah. And so the reason I ask is because, the state's attorney has to prove all the elements of whatever crime they're charging, and this, as written, is saying that there'll be a permissive inference that the proximate cause of death is the person's use of the regulated drug if it contains fentanyl. And I think that we should probably hear from defense attorneys as to how, and the state's attorney, as to how this can work, or even if it's possible. I just think that this is something with death resulting, and it is, part of this language is changing how the defense will defend their client. And so I just have some concerns about it.
Sorry.
Well, I think the testimony from the lab from Trish Condi was that 100% of the glassine bags that they tested contained fentanyl. So what I think they're assuming here is if death comes from an opiate, that fentanyl was in the product. That's what I think is going on here now. It's a legitimate question. We should hear from both the defendant in general and the stationary, so.
So I don't see anything in Title 15 that uses permissive inference, but we do have it for the drug statutes that have a trafficking penalty. And it's, and so, and the permissive inference is used in those circumstances where if a person possesses a certain large amount of that drug, then there's a permissive inference that they were trafficking. And so, you know, by permissive inference, we mean that, you know, when the fact finder is looking at this, that, you know, it's like if you find A, like this person has 6 kilos of cocaine, then you may, but you're not required to infer that they were trafficking.
Oh, and just the, I mean, the other thought that I'm also having is, you know, let's say somebody has a heart attack, you know, is the heart attack, and they're also using drugs at the same time, is the heart attack the actual cause of death? Or, you know, yeah, so that's my thoughts on that.
And I do think you're right on this one, is I did have a little bit of concern around whether or not it was clear around, so when you say a fact that a dispensed or sold substance contains more than one regulated drug shall not be a defense under the section if the cause of death is the use of the dispensed or sold substance that contain one or more drug. And so I think there just should be a little more, and just make sure that we understand the various permutations of how that could play out. Just to make sure that we've got the language exactly as y'all.
I agree with you. We should have more of a discussion. So more of a discussion of that, more of a discussion of the xylazine. Next issue is, do you want to add make this the public safety bill and add sections of S-209, ghost gun bill, on the juvenile, raise the age stuff. Now that we've got into rent, xylazine just suddenly expanded from its prior iteration, which would leave 209 just ghost guns.
Well, what if we like certain portions of bills and we don't like certain portions of other bills? And what do we do with that? I mean, I don't want to dump certain portions of certain bills that, in fact, I support them and they're good.
I don't know, I'm just making a suggestion.
I mean, with the expansion of this to include rent, it does make sense to me that and I know that the juvenile offenses portion of S-209 does include various types of trafficking. It would make sense to me to put this in here and have it be a broader bill touching on drug-related offenses. So I would support that change.
We're just waiting for your opinions on it.
I'm just here for the ride. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, so adding the Big 12 changes to this bill is what we're thinking.
That's what I'm proposing,
Yeah.
because this should become more of a public safety bill that I think we could point to. It's, while the ghost guns is a public safety issue in my mind, the only reason to raise it is what we've seen in Bennington and Rutland and other areas of the state. But the drug, this has become more of a drug bill and more of a public safety aspect in that sort of respect.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and it is more relevant. Yeah, it's relevant to this one, so fine with that.
Yeah, the drug trafficking with the changes we've already made to that. And then I'm open to consideration of that. And the ghost gun is just a gun bill. but it's a public safety issue for me. But I know some people are gonna vote against it, some vote for it, based on position of various groups.
So I just want to correct myself is that if apparently we would need to do a veterinary, like a legitimate veterinary carve out likely when I'm just kind of looking at some of the other legislation out there because it's not a controlled substance. So I'll do a little research on it, and then I think it would be good for you to hear from the Veterinary Association next week, and then we can craft it to make sure that the legitimate uses are, pardon?
So many veterinary businesses have been bought out by major corporations, it's not like it used to be.
It does not. Isn't there like a Vermont
There's a Vermont
Veterinary
Veterinary Board.
Association?
Yeah, actually, Representative Bartholomew, was he
He was a
a
vet.
veterinarian? He may have that information.
My vet used to or may still be on that board.
I can certainly ask.
Yeah, yeah, well, any help you can give Ben in finding the appropriate veterinarian.
So are we done going over this? I have a question. I just don't want to interrupt Michelle. She's not done this.
I'm done.
No, I'm not done. With S 58?
Yeah.
Are there any other areas that you wanna?
Well, I just have a question. I mean, page 1, an act relating to increasing the penalties for subsequent offenses for trafficking and dispensing of sale of regular drug. And then I just heard, that we're gonna take out the mandatory 2 or 3 year period. I mean, when the bill itself is to address crime. And it states in here that we're going to increase the penalties and we're taking penalties out.
You oftentimes, there'll be a bill is introduced and then the bill will change over time and just once you decide what's in this bill, I'll retitle it in the amendment. So whatever you decide from a policy perspective, if there's some pieces that have been added or some pieces out, you'll have a new title.
I did it. I take full responsibility for it. If we want to vote on it or have a decision about taking that out or not, I'll give you my reasons for taking it out. Number one was the lack of exuberance for the mandatory minimum from my state's attorney. That hit me by surprise, quite frankly, because she was the one who asked me to do this bill. Second reason is, I think some of the testimony pointed to the fact when you have a mandatory minimum, you end up with longer jury trials, more fighting, and less resolve because the person doesn't want to face the mandatory minimum. So you have a more drawn out event. I think that was Matt Valerio's testimony. Then we were going to hear from the ACLU about their opposition to it, but that wasn't my reason. My reason were those two. And if we want to have a discussion to put it in or take it out, fine. I just asked Michelle to draft it to take that section out.
So other than that section, Senator Sears, other than that section, are we or are we not addressing penalties, increasing penalties? And if so, where are they in this bill?
The increased penalties are for death resulting.
Which is what, it was what, and is going to be what now?
It is, if you look at the language, starting on page 2. So right now, so it's 2 years and there's a mandatory minimum of 2 years.
Page 2, where are you? Line.
If you look at line 6, so the penalty is 2 years to 20 years. And then if you look down at subsection C, there's this language and you'll see it. This language is in some of the sex offenses where you can't, the 2 year mandatory minimum has to be served. It can't be suspended or deferred or served on a community sentence. And the person's not eligible for probation or parole or furlough until the expiration of the mandatory minimum. So that is new, so that you would have to serve that mandatory minimum. There is a kind of an escape clause there right after that, is that the court can choose to waive that requirement that the person serve the mandatory minimum if the court determines and makes written findings on the record that the sentence will serve the interests of justice.
That's from the section under too, right?
Yeah, I
That
mean, I think,
language, I mean, appears with the mandatory minimums for sex offenders.
right.
So we haven't increased anything, we just said you're not eligible
Well,
for
that
parole or
actually-
probation.
It's saying
or-
that you have to serve
You have to
the
serve the 2
two.
years.
The original section 2 on the fentanyl didn't increase the maximum. It stayed at 30 years.
The maximum is gonna be up to the judge, okay, whatever he or she wants to assign. My concern is the minimum,
Right.
the mandatory or lack thereof. Of the minimum.
Well, there would no, if this bill passed in its present form, there'd be no mandatory minimum for fentanyl.
There'd be no mandatory minimum for fentanyl.
There is none today, and there will be none.
So thus, then we're not increasing penalties for,
Well, this bill would change that. There would
No,
be
I
the
think that's
mandatory.
being removed.
No, there's a
Right.
mandatory minimum for death.
Oh, okay.
death resulting.
That's what's left.
But that went from 3 to 2, or you,
No, that was always 2 in the bill. The bill was introduced, I believe, was in 2. Make it true.
so what was the 3 then? What was that for? Was that for death
That
result?
was the fentanyl.
Just for possession of fentanyl?
No, that's,
Trafficking. So, dispense.
so a current law for fentanyl is dispensing any is 3 years and selling is 5. The bill as introduced did not increase the penalties for fentanyl. The language that was taken out was related to second and subsequent offenses. And not being able to, so if you look at, I mean, do you want to look at the language that was in the bill as introduced, or?
I just wanna know if it meets what it says
When
on
you say-
page 1.
When you say trafficking, so as the bill is, as introduced, there was for trafficking, for second or subsequent offense for trafficking, cannabis, cocaine, heroin, those kinds of things. It does establish a mandatory minimum of 3 years and a maximum of 30 years. Now, first offense of trafficking is a 30-year max anyway, so there's nothing on that end. But what you're losing by taking out section 2 is a mandatory minimum of 3 years for second offense trafficking.
Oh, it's for second offense, so first offense is 2 years, second offense would be 3 years?
No, there's
Mandatory?
no mandatory minimum
No
on the first
mandatory.
offense.
There's currently none, and there would be none. There would be only on the second, so.
I could see it on, the first offense, but this is the second, subsequent offense of trafficking. We're taking that out or lowering it?
No, we're not lowering the third, it's still a 30-year maximum.
Minimum, talking about the minimum, sir.
There is no minimum.
There is no minimum.
I mean,
No mandatory minimum.
That's what I'm talking about.
it might be helpful to maybe hear from crime, I can't remember that they're changing in crime research group about, you could look at what the charges and dispositions for trafficking are now. The last time we looked at that, it was a few years ago, but there actually aren't very many charged under trafficking, but that may have really certainly changed in the last few years. I don't know, because a lot of the larger cases go federal. But you can, from the research group, they can show you what the actual sentences are being given. So there may be a minimum, so you can see from that data, what's the minimum, what's the maximum that are being ordered now under the statute, if that's helpful.
Anything I can get at this point in time, I guess would be helpful, because I need to break it all down as to what I'm looking at once again, so. Where we were, where we want to be, what's been removed, or what's, just a little flow
The
chart.
only thing that's been removed,
Is section 2 of the bill is
section
introduced.
2 is
That's it.
introduced, the fentanyl 3-year mandatory minimum for second and subsequent offense. What's been added is the rent, there was always the fentanyl section 1, and there was always the section, what's now section 2, was section 3, that's the selling with death resulting. And
So
then we're adding the unlawful occupant, that's section 3, and then there was a discussion of adding the xylazine in section 4, and then there was a discussion of adding the Big 12, increase in Big 12 offenses, which should be section 5, and then effective date would be section 6. So far, that's been the discussion.
So, Sarno, so the current law with regard to second and subsequent offenses for drug crimes is a doubling of the penalty of the underlying penalty. You know, like I said, I think during my walkthrough, you know, I kind of forget about that one. We don't hear about it much. And
Well, that's what fentanyl does, and we could add that back in.
No, I'm saying that so like a trafficking of fentanyl for a second and subsequence under current law would be potentially up to 60 years under current law, but there's no mandatory minimum. So if your focus is on the mandatory minimum.
That's what I'm focusing on, yes.
Okay. There is no mandatory minimum currently in law or in this amendment.
No minimum. Okay, thank you.
Do you want me to see if I can get the data on sentencing for trafficking offenses or or not necessary? Okay.
The question is, should we have a mandatory minimum? I should have left it to the committee to decide. I apologize. I'm simply getting ahead of myself.
It happens.
Pardon me?
So it certainly happens.
Right. So, is there interest in going back to the mandatory minimum for fentanyl? I mean, for fentanyl.
With death resulting?
No.
That's in the
statute.
statute and that's not being reduced.
I'm supporting that mandatory minimum because people were dying, and when people die, the victims need an opportunity. The family of the victim needs an opportunity to see justice done. And there's been too many cases that I'm familiar with and actually know some of the victims where I don't think people feel that it's been dealt with appropriately in the courts. That death of that man.
Well, my opinion may differ from other members of the committee here, obviously, but I don't know how we're gonna get tough on crime or tough on drugs. In fact, we don't do exactly that. And so I would push for the 2-year mandatory, 3-year mandatory minimum
For the second or subsequent offenses?
for the second or subsequent offenses.
For any of the drug trafficking. Okay.
On the drug trafficking of fentanyl, that was all that was in there, wasn't
It applied to trafficking of all drugs.
I thought it was just fentanyl.
No.
Yes, Senator Bowski.
I'm sure what I'm about to say is going to surprise no one, but I do not support mandatory minimums at all. So would not be supportive of adding any mandatory minimum back into this bill. We have said before and seen through history that we won't adjust our way out of the drug crisis. And so I think we have to really not repeat the mistakes of the past and really take a different tack. So again, as I'm sure it comes as no surprise, I don't support mandatory minimums.
Yeah, I mean, based on the neutral opinion, I want to say, of the very people who prosecute these crimes regarding mandatory minimums, and as far as I'm aware, a lack of data that shows that mandatory minimums make drug crimes go down. I'm not sure I really support mandatory minimums. I'm not sure why it really makes sense in this bill, especially when we have a carve out that says, in the interest of justice, you actually don't have to have a mandatory minimum. So, yeah. Not a huge fan of it. If there's data or information that I haven't seen yet that shows that mandatory minimums do bring down overdoses and they do reduce the amount of drug trafficking, then I'm genuinely open to changing my position, but I haven't seen that yet.
I don't know how many states have mandatory minimums. Can you do a quick search with MCSL or
And
CS?
see,
How many states have mandatory minimums for drug trafficking?
okay,
Obviously, I'm gonna vote to take that section out, but not this section, not the overdose or death result.
I think it's a little tough because states are gonna vary, they're not necessarily gonna call it trafficking.
Yeah.
They're, and
Class
it's
D
gonna,
felony, class B.
yeah, like it's, I mean, I could see if Michael Trina could
Well, we
do some
put the
research about like maybe just mandatory minimums
My
for drug
experience-
offenses.
My experience with mandatory minimums, the arguments and so forth, came after the Brooke Bennett murder, Michael Jakes. And it showed, we did this committee went out, a number of public hearings around the state. And was it 2009, 2010, somewhere in there,
It was 2008.
2008. And we went all over the state, we held a number of hearings and came back and we did create mandatory minimums on several sex crimes. We also updated a lot of the sex crimes. Michelle was active as the legislative counsel, went around with us. And it was a fascinating period of this committee's history. We came back, it became the first bill we did that year. Peter Shumlin was pro tem. Brian Doobie was the lieutenant governor, and I remember meeting with Peter and Brian and Kevin Mullen in Brattleboro and starting the whole process from there. Before it was agreed, Governor Douglas had called for a special session, and I think we all wanted to avoid that. So we ended up, the four of us decided to do that. We ended up with mandatory minimums for the sex crimes. The downside we've heard is that some of those cases became more and more litigious because of the mandatory minimum, but I think it was a response to a problem. So I think there's some legitimacy for what you're asking for on the federal. So we can still discuss it, but it seems like the majority of the committee is not in favor of doing it on the federal. I haven't taken a poll yet on the other.
I mean, again, I will reiterate, if there is actually information that shows that mandatory minimums bring drug trafficking down and overdoses down, I'll support it.
I don't know where you get that.
Well, I understand where you're coming from, Senator Hashim, but data always seems to take a while. We don't have the 2023 data that we all been desperately looking for. And I believe that a commissioner of the Department of Public Safety in our joint hearing up there stated that we all live on data. We all want to see data, but we don't need it to see what's happening in our streets today, in Bennington today, or whatever else. So in the meantime, people are dying. And that's why I support the mandatory minimums.
Senator Bilhowski.
Yeah, I mean, similar to Senator Rashim, the data does not seem to support, and while we may not have data for this drug crisis, we have data from plenty in the past, and the response has always been to criminalize more, and it hasn't solved the problem. It didn't solve it in the 1980s and 90s, it didn't, so I think it's time to stop doing the same thing we've always done that has shown not to work, and instead really look at transforming a system where people get what they need. And you know, we've heard, again, from the state's attorneys that this has created other issues in other places, and certainly my heart goes out, and I too have friends and family who have lost loved ones to overdoses. And I want them to get justice. I just don't know that that is found in further criminalization, and I respect that there may not be 2023 data, but there is decades of data from the way we've responded to previous influxes of various drugs into our system.
But part of the feeling amongst many is our drug laws are lax. I'm all for as much treatment as possible. But you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink it. And for some people, they have to hit rock bottom before they're actually amenable to treatment. And then when they're amenable to treatment may not be available. So I think you do have to have, for the drug traffickers, certain laws. I'm not debating that whether mandatory minimums are good or bad, but you have to have certain laws, and I think our laws are not, I think we're being too lax on some of these traffickers. I mean, I've been in court, watched the repeated violations of conditions with firearms, with other drug trafficking efforts.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think the one thing too is the public discourse often follows what we're talking about and how we're talking about it. And there are other ways that aren't retributive, but are instead restorative and built on justice and healing. I also think oftentimes victims are invoked to point to one direction or the other, and I imagine that there isn't unanimity amongst victims that this is the response they would like to see. I certainly know that at least one person in my life is completely opposed to more criminalization who lost a loved one to an overdose. So I think there's a wide range of opinions even within the community of victims.
One more question, or I guess comment, is that I think we should think about is it that the laws are too lax, or that they're taking a very long time to actually get to that enforcement? What we heard at the very beginning in January is that part of deterrence, I believe, also requires that fear of being punished in closer proximity to the crime. So what I'm saying is if somebody, is having their case disposed of 6 months down the road, as opposed to 3 years down the road, that is one of the factors to take into consideration. I mean, if these cases are taking years, people are not going to be nearly as concerned about the consequences. Whereas if they actually have a speedy trial and get to the end of their case much sooner and face the consequences.
I think it's both. I think it's also the lack, particularly with the young people, it's the lack of replacement. 4 years without replacement for particularly hard and difficult to place teenagers, and the administration has botched case after, in my opinion. The administration and the legislature have lost its opportunities to try to create one of these programs. And right now we have the Middlesex 4 beds coming online, but we don't even have a provider willing to step up and run the program. So without that, you're stuck with a system that's in crisis I mean, I know I'll give the administration credit that they thought Newberry was the answer, and didn't anticipate the pushback. But also, I would say that the administration, at some point, needed to take quicker action, and I don't think they realized the scope of the difficulty. And that has something to do with particularly the out-of-state drug trafficking. I'm seeing, there's no doubt in my mind about that. And additionally, I think that, so I don't know if it's a weak laws or if it's a weak response. I totally agree with you that if the case is dealt with quickly, no matter what the outcome is, whether it's jail, probation, or even, diversion, if the case is dealt with quickly, it has a bigger impact than if it waits 3 to 5 years. And I would say if somebody didn't get in trouble for 3 to 5 years, unless it was a murder or something, what's the point that this, to continue to prosecute?
No, I agree with you, Senator Sears, about the real dire need for more services for juveniles. The one thing I do want to point to, just sort of circling back to the data conversation, and I'm happy to send this to Ben to put on the committee page for the official record, but the National Institute of Justice, which is run by our federal government, and I know you're skeptical, has done multiple research studies that show that increasing the severity of punishment does not further deter crime. The certainty of being caught is a powerful deterrent, but increased punishment does not deter crime. And in fact, longer prison sentences increase rates of recidivism and more violent crimes in the community. So I would actually argue that there is data and evidence to support that mandatory minimums and increased punishment is actually going to harm public safety, not help it. And again, I'm happy to send this to Ben to put on the committee page.
Yes.
If anybody's interested, I was just doing just looking around the Rand Corporation, who, the Vermont legislature has contracted with before to do studies. There's one on, are mandatory minimum drug sentences cost effective? I can send that to if anybody's, I don't know what they say, but.
Are they?
Probably
I would have
It's expensive to incarcerate someone.
Let me jump down to the conclusion. It's a little long. Sentences for serious crimes have intuitive appeal. They respond to deeply held beliefs about punishment for evil actions. But in the case of black market crimes like drug dealing, a jailed supplier is often replaced by another supplier.
Can we?
Yeah, I can send it.
Why don't we ask the crime research group for information on actual sentences for people convicted of drug trafficking?
Okay.
So are they?
We're all asking for charges because there
charge.
some things may get picked up by the Fed, so there may be charges and then they get.
Well, but actual sentences.
Sure, yeah.
Because I'd like to know if we have a 30-year maximum, for example, for fentanyl, but we're only sentencing to 5 years, that's quite a difference. Are we sentencing for the maximum? And are we using minimums? They can use minimums. Well, we can put minimums in that are not mandatory. Right?
You mean like a sentencing guideline?
Yeah. We do that frequently.
Not really, no.
No? We should. For example, if you wanted to put in I thought murder had is murder mandatory? Or is it manslaughter that's gotta be?
I always
Maybe
forget
it's
on the
manslaughter
homicide.
has the wording that 15 to something, and then, but it's not mandatory.
You may be right, I don't typically work on the homicide ones, Eric does it, so,
Check
me see.
manslaughter.
okay. I think manslaughter is like a 1-year minimum.
Maybe it's
See.
mandatory.
Yeah, it's a mandatory, so manslaughter is 1 year to 15 years, so it's mandatory, 1 year mandatory minimum for manslaughter.
There's a second degree murder, right? That probably has the 15 year.
So, second degree murder is 20 to life. And first degree murder is 35 to life. And then I think maybe you're thinking about like the mitigating circumstances.
Okay.
They weigh like aggravating or mitigating circumstances. So, punishment for murder in the first degree shall be imprisonment for life and for a minimum of 35 years, unless a jury finds that there are aggravating or mitigating factors which justify a different minimum term. So establishing a
That's
minimum, but
maybe
then you
what
could
I-
have mitigating factors and then you would deviate down.
So you could do that with the death result. In the drug.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're gonna adjourn. So I think it's better to adjourn. Have a great weekend, everybody. Enjoy.